Hi, I'm Ted Haptegaber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
Thank you for coming out, and you're in for a treat. You really don't need me here. We could just
I
press the button.
would not want to be here with anyone else.
Stacy Schiff will go. No. I'm delighted to be able to talk with you. And I want to talk to you about process as much as anything else about all your work, because I think it's so fascinating, I hope you do too, about how to peer into how a Pulitzer Prize winning person makes books, because these books don't just happen. It's a lot of work, right? Here you are enjoying the fruits of it all. And what was this picture of
I know, isn't that amazing?
Jessica Parker, did you all see this holding up?
I thought you were talking
No,
about
this
what the picture on
is
the
pretty amazing,
right.
but tell us about the Hollywood part of it first,
Well,
even though it was
let's
in New
start
York.
with Hollywood.
Yeah,
right?
since we're here.
Someone tweeted out a picture of Sarah Jessica Parker reading the book on set, which I just find astonishing that someone could be standing on a street in New York reading while the world revolved around her and she had the attention to do it. So yeah, kind of great, right?
And looking very glamorous,
Well, I couldn't
too.
tell, was she on page one or was she halfway through it? That was unclear to me, but looking very glamorous. Although I did send that to the art director who designed the jacket, who was rather peeved that she had not better coordinated her outfit to go with his book. So.
Well, we'll get a word into her about that. And no context on it. It was just that she was
no
reading
context.
it. There's no reason.
She's a very big reader.
Oh.
And apparently a reader of American history. And descends from one of the Salem witches, so I know she had read the previous book.
Ah, okay.
That's the only other piece of context.
You had a little bit of context with her. Okay, and so what about this picture? Because this is pretty fantastic.
So the problem with this book, the problem with putting a jacket on this book, is that we have really only one great contemporaneous portrait of Samuel Adams, which is the John Singleton Copley portrait. And it's very well known, it's been used over and over. It's a heroic, it's a history painting. It's not necessarily an inviting painting. So what do you do for a jacket? And in this case, the brilliant art director came up with the idea of doing a modern engraving meant to look old based on the statue of Samuel Adams in Boston, partly because this gives us Adams at a younger age, which is his age in the course of the book, as opposed to the older, very gray, more corpulent Samuel Adams in the Copley portrait.
And that's part of making a book, right?
Right, and we know he had piercing blue eyes, and it is indeed based on his likeness, but it is a modern engraving. It's a modern engraving made to look, as one friend of mine put it, like money. So
right, maybe that's why it was so arresting to me. Yes. Okay, so before we start talking about why you wrote this book, I want to talk about your wonderful husband is here in the audience tonight, and I want to talk about how you got into this biography thing, because there's so many different types of writing. Writers can become. You were on your honeymoon many moons ago.
You have done your research.
I have. I like these.
I know. I'd like to do the research too.
I could write your biography now, but we won't do that. Okay, so you were on your honeymoon and you were reading a memoir by a French aviator.
As one does on one's honeymoon.
Right, so that was my first question.
I was also reading The Duke of Deception. Why didn't I think about writing about Geoffrey Wolfe, right? Anyway, go ahead.
So that was where were you on your honeymoon, first of all?
We were in New Zealand.
Okay.
And I was reading Wind, Sand, and Stars for no apparent reason, and suddenly realized that I think I was just struck. I think, as we all do, I read Saint-Exupéry when I was in 7th grade, and never went back to him, and was struck by the beauty of the prose. And somehow, between thinking this book really still lives, and it's one of the best descriptions of flight that we have, and knowing that he had lived much of his adult life in North America and had written The Little Prince, in fact, in New York City, began to think there really should be a biography of him. And it's time now really to issue one. And I was in publishing at the time and thought, great, I'll find a writer who will, or a biographer with a track record who will take on the project. And every time I went to lunch with the agent of a potential victim for this project, I realized I didn't want to give up the idea. So slowly, I'm a little thick sometimes, it began to dawn on me that I really wanted to write the book myself.
But up until that point, you had been doing the ghost writing that an editor does, which is basically holding the hand of a nervous writer or an anxious
Nervous
writer.
writers? What are
Not a
those?
concept,
Nothing we
right?
would know, yeah.
And you were, I read that you said you wrote a lot of jacket copy, flap copy, but you had never written a book. It hadn't occurred to you, even though you've been working in publishing for close to 10 years at that point, not quite, that you were going to write a book someday, but it took this person to captivate you.
That one I can't explain. That was really jumping off the ledge, for which my husband deserves a great deal of credit because he pushed off the ledge, I might add. But I think there's always that question of, what made you think the first time you actually set out to write a book, what made you think you could do it, right? It's a strange and magical and unthinkable concept, really,
But
right?
especially when you're digging into the life of a deceased person you've never met, who doesn't have a whole lot out there. Tell us what you did. Okay, so now that you've resolved that you're going to write that book, I'm going to ask you that about all your books, so get ready.
That one is a particularly interesting one because, sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're less lucky. The lucky part was that Saint-Exupéry had died in 1944, and he died young. He was 44. But at the end of his life, he flew with a bunch of very young American aviators because he's based in Corsica with an American squadron. So all of those then very young men were immensely fond of him, and he had made a huge impression on all of them because they knew him as this legendary Frenchman. They weren't really even sure why he was so legendary, but he just stood out. He was so much older and so much larger and so unable to speak English, and he was an immensely charismatic human being. So I had this Greek chorus, in a funny way, of these Americans who had known him so well and remembered him so vividly. And then I had the girlfriends, the mistress, there were some veterans even who had sort of founded the first routes of the mail flights for France with him when he was much younger. They were in their 90s. It was the historical sweet spot in a way. So I had a tremendous number of people under whom he had served, with whom he had written, for whom he had published, just a huge cast of characters to interview, which, as you know, is also a curse.
Right,
right?
right. But so do you take a piece of paper? I'm trying to study up on how the master does it so that I can learn. You take a piece of paper and you write out this cast of characters. What was
Well,
the
a smart
attack?
person would take the oldest person and start there, right? I didn't do that. What I did do, and this is, remember, pre-internet, pre-Google, you were still reading the newspaper every week, hoping that someone you needed to interview wasn't on the obituaries page.
1989-ish, this is
1990, exactly. I basically drew, most of these people were in France, and I literally drew a map of France and figured out where everyone I needed to interview was, and then spent a tremendous amount of time in trains. And then, interestingly, the girlfriend in whose home Saint-Exupéry had written a lot of The Little Prince was in LA. So there were a couple of trips to LA to see her. And then there was a sort of Parisian mistress with whom I spent a great deal of time. And they, of course, were very curious, one of them about the other. So that was also an interesting, you sometimes get caught up in some of the legacy where you might not want to get caught up.
Yes.
And that was an odd relationship because she, on the one hand, wanted to encourage me, but didn't really want to be very cordial with me. And I went to see her weekly, week after week after week, and she was just odious with me throughout the project.
Was that the one who said, I'm not going to give you these, you'll have to die before
She basically said, when I said at one point, will I ever see her, what will happen to your papers? And she said, I'm going to give them to the Bibliothèque Nationale, and they'll be opened in 60 years. You'll be dead by then. Exactly. She was lovely. She was a lovely woman, yes.
Run away, sister.
Yes.
Don't think you're getting more out of me.
Exactly.
So I presume that you spoke French. Your mother was a professor. Your husband has French lineage. There's some aviation in the family too, I read. So
all of those things were very useful.
Yeah. I would think so.
Yeah.
I would think so.
I thought when I started the book, I thought I would learn to fly. I somehow decided I was going to learn to pilot a plane, but I ended up writing the book without learning that. But I could tell you how to pilot any aircraft which was made before 1935. At a certain point, I'm not sure I could do that anymore.
Flight simulators
Exactly.
help you write that. Okay, so you amass this research, And I've read that at that time you were writing longhand. Is that possible?
You make it sound like I was writing in hieroglyphics or something.
Which is
possible as well, I suppose.
Right, these days.
I do still write longhand. I'm not the only one. There are a few of us still left.
Name them, out them.
Bob Caro.
Wow, he does too.
Someone who was just written up in the paper, a novelist, also came clean about the fact that she writes longhand. I'm not forgetting who it was. My problem is very simple. I type really fast, and I don't think that fast. And I feel I'm just sloppier if I'm typing. I'm longer, first of all, because it's easier. So I'm less concise. And it's so much hard. There's something about the actual physical movement of the lead on because I write with a pencil, it's even worse, of the lead on the paper. That just, for me, that's where the thinking is. And I'm sure that that's just an antiquated, that's how I've always done it, and so that's how I continue to do it. But somehow it's in that sort of physical process that the thinking takes place. And I don't think I could actually write I could maybe write a piece, I doubt it, on anything other than a piece of paper.
Wow.
I know, it's horrible, isn't it?
I won't even ask you how you deal with footnotes and sourcing, because that's too inside
clearly
baseball.
that's,
Because that's crazy. Okay, so you're writing, at a certain point, I read that you felt that you needed to do all the research before you started writing. Was that with that first book? Let's stay on that one just for a minute, because that's what set the tone for your rest of your career so far. I mean, you write this book. At what point did you know you were ready to write, that you had enough from the mistresses and the...
I think you probably know this point too. There's a point where the material starts to kind of burble, and it's fermenting in some way, and you realize it's beginning to kind of speak to you, and then your publisher is calling at the same time. So somewhere between those two moments, you think, oh, maybe I should start writing this thing. And then what happens is, and I can give you a perfect example with that first book. You're writing along, and you hit, it's almost as if you hit glare ice. You hit an area where you think, oh my gosh, I actually need to go back into the archives for this. And in the case of the Saint-Exupéry book, it was because I realized that he is in Paris during World War I, and though I had researched the life out of World War II, I had never really thought about what it was like to be a schoolboy in school in Paris during World War I. So back to the library I went. But for the most part, yes, I like to have done the interviews and to have done the bulk of the research, because you don't know where the book is going at least I don't, until you have that under your belt. And you start to be able to navigate your way around the themes once you have that material.
Right, and that's what I love, is how you say you go into each of these with the concept, obviously, or not the concept, the subject, and then from there you make your decisions. You haven't gone in with a thesis necessarily up front. Okay, so that book comes
Which you don't
out.
either, right?
Well, no, I don't, but we won't talk
Okay, and
about
it's Claire Keegan who's the other person who writes by hand. Just since I'm outing people while I'm up here.
the pencil manufacturers are going to start sending boxes to you.
That would be fine.
Okay, so you write this book, it comes out, it gets all kinds of super press. You are the next great biographer, and it's nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. But there's a funny story about how it was the nomination process and what your agent said to you. Talk about that.
You have really read up. You don't know that you're nominated for
Right,
books.
you don't.
I think if you're a journalist, you know that your editors have put you up. So out of the blue, and to my great surprise, came the news that it was one of the 3 finalists. Which for me was immensely thrilling. It was my first book. I had never imagined such a thing. I didn't even know there was a thing. And so I, in enormous excitement, called my then agent and said, the book was a finalist for the Pulitzer. And she said, Stacy, that means you lost. Which promptly deflating my balloon, exactly.
But
yes, and she was a purist of the first rank. I mean, now you see on the covers of books, finalist for the National Book Award or finalist for the whatever prize, and her feeling was, you lost. Why are you advertising that fact? So yes, so she was of a different, era altogether.
She wouldn't cut it on social media, probably.
No, exactly.
Okay, so you are now fully out of editing other people's books and in your world, and you have that strange feeling when you're done with a book.
What is that feeling, actually?
You described it as postpartum.
It is postpartum with a little edge of ecstasy, right? Because you've shuffled this person off finally, but there's an enormous, yawning hole in your life afterwards too, right?
But your husband's probably happy that this other man isn't at your house anymore, at least only in material, if not in your psyche as you're sleeping, because I'm sure you were at a certain point dreaming all kinds of Saint X
Oh, I have a
stories.
dream. Have you ever had this? Have you ever dreamed of the previous biographer? I've had that one where the previous biographer won't give me material. I mean, it's pretty intense, the dream life of a biographer
Are they
sometimes.
chasing you down a dark road or something?
No, I had one dream with my first subject, with Saint-Exupéry, where he came to me in a dream and he said he wouldn't reveal himself to me until I started spending more time with my children. And I thought, well, that doesn't work that way. So yeah, it's.
No, I've never had that because I write about people nobody really cares about, but hopefully we make them care. Okay, so you're done with book one and you want to do book two after you get over that delirious exhilaration, crazy feeling of, oh my God, I'm not thinking about someone 24 hours a day who I don't know.
And then you think there was something about that was mildly appealing, but I can't quite put my finger on what it was. Yes.
Right. And you start thinking, I'm going to write about marriage somehow, maybe vaguely, and you wind up writing a book that wins the Pulitzer Prize. Let's talk a little bit about that, because in that case, you're writing about someone who was the wife of someone famous, about whom there was not that much known. What made you want to look at Véra and go down the hole of, as you put it, needle in a haystack versus haystack in a haystack? I mean, there's nothing.
It's really like the Goldilocks problem of biography, right? You either have too much research or you have too much material or you have not enough material. It never seems to be right down. Have you ever had a subject where it's actually the right amount of research? No, it doesn't exist,
no.
Right? Yeah. So Véra was perfect in terms of the amount of material in that Véra Nabokov had either typed or written or collaborated on every piece of paper, essentially, that leaves Nabokov's study. So she's an intimate part of the entire process. But neither of his two biographers had the courage really to write about her, because she had told them, she was the keeper of the archives, obviously, and they had been writing in her lifetime, and she had basically told them that she didn't want to be in the book. So they had every reason to leave her out of the story, and you can kind of hear them, their chairs are scraping as they're letting her leave the room. And I'm thinking, but who is that person who clearly controls everything and is on every one of those pages in such a meaningful way? And leaves Nabokov lines which he integrates into his work. But I knew very little of that at the outset. What I knew was I had this undying affection for Nabokov's work, which I had read more of than anyone probably should. I knew that she went to class with him every day when he taught at Cornell and sat in the lecture hall, which was just like, no, what professor did that? Right?
You found that out from a student, right? You ferreted out.
People mentioned it over the years. It's in the previous biographers' books. And no one had ever really questioned it. But obviously they made for kind of a bizarre act at Cornell because she went everywhere with him. And the theories for that were great. I mean, some of the students, all of the students tried to make sense of what she was doing there. Mm-hmm. And they would come up with reasons like he was blind and she was the seeing eye dog, or she was there to protect him from co-eds. She was his mother. I loved that one. So there were all sorts of theories. So I knew she was with him every day in the lecture hall. I knew she carried a gun, which was true. I knew that she was Jewish and he was not, which in those aristocratic Russian circles was unusual. And I knew most of all that every book is dedicated to her. And that just seems odd. As Nicholson Baker once said, that's like a nervous tick to just dedicate every book to the same person. And that was pretty much all I had to go on at the outset.
So you read his biographies and his works, and that's where you said, aha. And so did you write a proposal at that point? Did you
I wrote a proposal, and I thought it was a lunatic idea. I mean, we were still at that point where I think we were only just beginning to think about the underdocumented women in men's lives. The Nora Joyce book had come out. Mm-hmm. Jean Strauss's book had come out. I mean, there were some books. Obviously, Nancy Milford's Zelda had come out. So there was a hint of where we were going, but I still think I felt like I was on very tentative ground. I wasn't really sure that this mattered. And in a way, it was two books in one. It was a book about her and her heroism and her creativity, and it was really a book about showing him in a different light, because I didn't feel he was a Mandarin presence, and his biographers approached him with enormous deference, and I felt this was a more human way to approach him if I could write about the two of them collectively. But I did apologize to most people during those years for what I was doing because I thought it was a zany idea. So.
And that took about 5 years as the last one, the previous
I
one
feel
had.
like it always takes me, no matter how I do it, how efficiently or inefficiently I work, it takes me about 5 years. What about you?
I'm operating on that a little bit, but the last two were quickies because I got a job on one right after the other. So
they had, right.
Yeah, I needed the money, so it was a good thing. But I could have benefited from more time. And I think that's the other part that I want to illuminate for the viewing audience is how much time these books take. I mean, obviously,
Well, also,
Robert
COVID
Caro-
years are 2 years in one, right? So this book really took 10 years, I think.
And right, well, I'll ask you about where you were during all of that. Okay, so when you were working on Véra, were you aware that you were going to write a book that was going to win the Pulitzer Prize? I always love asking people who win Pulitzers that.
No, of course not. I mean, how could you even think that?
But you were uncovering incredible.
But I didn't know it was. I actually had an
it.
editor for that book, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you, who I'm not sure ever said this is a good book. And I think maybe 3 copies of that book were sold before the Pulitzer. I mean, it got fabulous reviews, and it really, I think it sold 10 copies. So no, it never occurred to me that anything was going to happen for that book.
And then the announcement came out. I think when it came out in paperback is what happened, and then it just really.
It must have been just around the time of paperback.
So.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so from there you go. Each time you're looking for something completely. There are people who, of course, spend their whole lives on one note.
Those are the smart people. Yes, because they've done the research for the next book with the previous book, right?
Well, yeah, but I get your point, which is why do the same book again, and why go into the same archives again, and why not go back to Paris in this case, right? And that's what you did with the next book with Ben Franklin. You were saying, I read that you wrote about not trusting autobiography, his very famous autobiography, and let's talk now a little bit about autobiography versus and memoir versus biography, and why biography is so important. And Ben Franklin, you zeroed in on a very specific topic as opposed to an all-encompassing biography. But what was that project like?
I think in a way that may have been born out from the Nabokov years, in that it was very clear to me that you could see your subject best when your subject is out of context in some way, or at least out of his or her comfort zone. There were many reasons I came to the Franklin book, but one reason to think the Franklin book is about his 8 years in France during the American Revolution. And it occurred to me that to take Franklin, whom we think we know so intimately, out of America, to put him in a language that he spoke poorly, to put him in a court where he was very much ill at ease and for many years on the defensive, was to see a very different Franklin. And the real question with that book, and I think a lot of people have asked this kind of question, is can you see a life better if you see it through one episode, through one period of time? So this was Franklin in the years that he spends in France, attempting to wring money out of the French court to underwrite the American Revolution, which arguably is as important an act as was George Washington's in the field. But Franklin's, because it happens on foreign soil, is one we like to think about a lot less, but which he considered to be the greatest adventure of his life, or the greatest achievement of his life. And so that was sort of my thinking. And because I figured out sooner or later why this was underwritten about, the material is all of it in the French archives. I would not wish 18th century handwriting on microfilm on anyone. It's really hard to read. It's a massive amount of material. For those 8 years, you have about 2.5 times what you have for the entire rest of Franklin's life. And you have just just a massive, this was the haystack of the haystack problem. Yeah, because you had Franklin's encircled by a set of French spies who are watching his every move, and they're encircled by a set of British spies. And every one of those men, as far as I can tell, must have been paid by the word because they're writing constantly about what Franklin is doing. So you have, his grocery list, when his laundry is done, when he goes, everything. So it was, it was an incredible wealth of material, but also, as you want to rise above the material in order to write the book. And it's a very complicated cast of characters as well. And everyone in the 18th century speaking of memoir, wrote a memoir. And the ones who didn't write a memoir published newspapers. So yeah, I just never thought I was going to rise above that material.
And so you marinate in it, you consume it. I mean, how do you rise above the material? It just really takes time as well as synthesis. I mean, the synthesis is time as well as ingesting it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's some kind of weird digestive process, isn't it?
Crazy,
I mean,
yeah.
you need to ingest it all, and then you kind of need to forget some of it, I think. And then I tend very slavishly and inefficiently to go through everything I have for each section of the book, so that I'm often using things that you don't think apply to one area for another area, and that's when you sort of begin to see the themes brewing, I think. But I don't know another way to do it, because you're seeing echoes of things at various junctures that you otherwise, I think, wouldn't have put together.
It's like being a psychiatrist, you're not really analyzing someone in that sense, but you are, and it's private detective work.
It is, I think, part psychiatry, very much, right? You're trying to see this person better than he or she could possibly have known him or herself.
And with the benefit of time, right, and the context. Right, because if you'd written any of these books now, you might come out
Nabokov
differently.
wrote the same love letter to his mistress that he wrote to his wife. Do you think he knew that? I don't think he probably remembered that he used the same lines, but we now know it, right?
Okay, so Cleopatra. So you're done with Ben Franklin, and you decide, I don't think I read a lot in advance of seeing you today, but I don't think I saw anywhere why Cleopatra captivated you enough. And I have to thank you publicly, because whenever somebody says to me, how do you write a book about someone who you don't know or you haven't met, I always say, well, Stacy Schiff wrote about Cleopatra. So
I didn't know Ben Franklin
possible.
either, I should probably admit at this moment. But, yeah.
Would you ever want to write about somebody you did know?
I always said I wouldn't. And I wonder how you feel about this, because I feel like there needs to be a kind of clinical distance. I just feel like the dust has to settle, and people aren't willing to speak until the subject is at least out of the picture somewhat. But now it's the one thing I haven't done, and now I'm kind of wondering, maybe that's what I do. I don't know. I've not completely closed the door to it, but until now I have always quailed at the idea of writing about someone with whom you could actually sit and talk.
I think it's time for a
Terrifying. Terrifying. Not a memoir.
Not a memoir.
The Cleopatra idea was actually an idea. It was my husband's idea, and since he's here tonight, he should get credit.
Yes.
It was an idea I had had before the Franklin book, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. And because there's no material. It isn't even the needle in the haystack. It's like a half a needle in the haystack. So I just couldn't see a way clear of doing it. And I think finally, after the Franklin years, I came around to the realization that you can have all the material in the world and you still can't answer basic questions. And then I started thinking, well, maybe you could do Cleopatra's life in sort of 6 scenes. So there's a marvelous scene from Plutarch of Cleopatra and Mark Antony out fishing, and you could do that scene, and then you could do, a couple of other scenes that are very accurate and are easily sourced. And then the more I read, the more I realized, strangely enough, there was enough material to write a complete life. And some of that is writing around the absences. For example, there is obviously no childhood. People didn't have childhoods in the ancient world, so we don't have Cleopatra's childhood. On the other hand, we know everything she would have read when she studied, because a classical education in the Hellenistic world was the same if you were well-born wherever you lived in the Mediterranean. So she would have read the same books that Mark Antony or Caesar read. She would have read them in the same order. She would have learned how to declaim, how to orate, do everything. We had the precise descriptions of those moments. Mm-hmm. So it was possible to substitute her education for her childhood, and I just hope nobody would notice that there was no childhood.
Was that a surprise that you were able to find a publisher for? After winning the Pulitzer, I would think it's a little easier to just suggest a book or propose a book, but were you surprised that the interest in that? Incredible.
I should say I had sold the Ben Franklin book before I won the Pulitzer. So that was dumb. Another mismanagement on my part. Cleopatra I don't think any of us anticipated would be a bestseller. So it was surprising that I could find a publisher for it. Wasn't entirely to me surprising, but that it turned out to be a bestseller came as an enormous surprise.
A huge bestseller, yeah. And now The Witches, before we get to the man of the evening, The Witches, let's talk about how that came about. And I want to also ask about why all of this is relevant, why history in general is relevant, but what led you to that?
I think after Cleopatra, I was thinking a lot about women's voices, and in particular how Cleopatra is written from really sources that are all of them very few people who wrote about Cleopatra liked Cleopatra. So you're really writing from her enemies. And somehow that made me start thinking about how women's voices are heard and contorted and mauled in history, which then took me somehow very quickly to Joan of Arc. And then Joan of Arc made me wonder about those. There are really, I think, only two moments in history where teenage virgins are kind of running the show, Joan of Arc and Salem, 1692. And somehow I started reading about the witch trials, and it was one of those things where you go into the library and the book you want to read isn't on the shelf, and which I think, unfortunately happens to a lot of us.
Yes.
And I just thought, there was probably a way to write this book in a really narrative fashion without working from a thesis. Most of the books that had been done had been trying to prove why what had happened, what was wrong, what so ailed the girls. When to me, the great mystery of Salem isn't what afflicted the girls, it's why the prosecution was so severe and so robust that year. So that was really the genesis of that, was sort of thinking, I felt like that book had fallen somewhat naturally out of Cleopatra in a way that those two books kind of went together to my mind in some way.
More of a logical.
Yeah.
Brian Lamb on C-SPAN did a wonderful interview with you illustrating how witch hunting is so part of our vernacular. And I thought that was fascinating, but that was years ago, and today I feel it's even...
Yeah, I don't think we were talking about witch hunts in quite the same way at that moment. Witch hunts were still things that happened to, disenfranchised women as opposed to powerful men at that moment.
Right,
yes.
Right. Was that any of these books, up until this point, I think the Saint X book was optioned. All of your books are so vivid and cinematic and detailed. I would think that Hollywood comes calling, but we know that Hollywood comes calling and doesn't always
Hollywood comes
execute.
Calling, exactly.
You want the money and hope that it
Hollywood
happens,
comes
right?
calling, exactly.
Yeah.
And then they come calling again,
Yes,
exactly.
if you're lucky, right. But I read that The Witches was in
No,
development?
the Franklin book, oddly enough, is being shot right now in France. And I think it's day 90 of the shoot, in fact. And so it'll be an Apple series probably next fall.
Exciting.
Yes.
And did you have anything to do with the making of it, or did they just take your book and...
I was involved with the scripts.
That's great. Did you like doing that? Or
So much fun. You
Was
know
it?
why? They can say things that aren't true. It's a shocking thing.
But that doesn't
It's
drive
so
you crazy?
liberating. It does drive one crazy.
Yes,
Yes.
I would think you
There are two
especially-
kinds of things. There's the embroidering on what we don't know, and then there's you just can't take the facts and you just can't crumple them. I'm sorry, those are the facts. So there are two very different levels of what you're comfortable, two very different comfort levels.
And are they trying to modernize it in any way, or is
No,
it set in
it's historical. It's actually immensely true to the history.
How exciting.
Brilliantly true to the history. The characters who are ancillary characters about whom we know very little now have stories unto themselves. But Franklin is Franklin, and very much is lines that we know from John Adams or from Franklin's contemporaries came out of Franklin's mouth, now come out of Michael Douglas's mouth. It's an astonishing thing.
That's great. When is that coming?
I think next fall. I'm not entirely certain.
Yeah, who knows?
They
Really.
don't tell the author stuff like that.
You'll get a check, I hope, or something like that. Okay, so Samuel Adams, not Sam Adams. You grew up in Adams, Massachusetts, as I've heard you say on your book tour. You didn't know that when you were growing up,
I knew that I was living in Adams, Massachusetts.
Yes,
what I
you did
did
know
not
that.
know was anything about Samuel Adams, to the point where I thought the statue in the center of town, I assumed was Samuel Adams. It's William McKinley. How did I get that so wrong? I don't even know why William McKinley is there, but anyway, he was not Samuel Adams.
Okay, but that's not why you decided that now is the time to tell this story, is it?
No, although I think I was a little bit mortified. I was mortified by how little I knew about him, and it was made worse by the fact that I come from Adams, Massachusetts. To a certain extent, this book too followed from the previous in that, and I think we've talked about this. What's interesting about 1692 is how slowly reason returns, how slowly anyone is willing to raise a hand and suggest that perhaps the witchcraft court is out of line. And in all fairness, it was a very dangerous thing to do, because once you express skepticism about witchcraft, you were generally accused of witchcraft yourself. And one of the people who first raises his hand, anonymously and very quietly, and suggests that if the girls who are making these accusations with their eyes closed, they're not seeing, they're imagining what they're seeing, was a 35-year-old Boston merchant named Thomas Brattle, who very much reminded me of Samuel Adams in the sense of having the starchy moral fiber to be able to take an unpopular stand and to hold to it. And to a certain extent, I think that the two of them fused there. And I was really, as I think all were, thinking a lot about fundamentals and what democracy rests on and where our values had come from. And both of those things, to some extent, combined with what his contemporaries had said about Adams, made me think, how is it possible that someone whom his contemporaries had said was so crucial was so paramount to the effort to independence, how could he have gone missing from the picture? Which was very much the question of Mrs. Nabokov, and this felt very much like the Nabokov book in terms of the research.
Although, sadly, it's not that surprising that a wife of a literary master is marginalized, but why would this fellow be marginalized? He did burn his papers, right?
We know from John Adams that he burns and shreds some of his papers to make sure that no one is compromised for anyone who has helped him, anyone else who has committed sedition is not in any way, in any kind of danger. He doesn't do himself any favors. He doesn't collect his papers at the end of his life, although John Adams will suggest that he do so. So he doesn't write himself into the history books. Mm-hmm. He's very modest, which I find immensely appealing. Very modest, very interested in being, in stage managing and leaving the stage to others. He is very much out of step with America after the founding of the country. America moves on to a very opulent capitalistic future. He's still sort of harking back to a simpler world of really fundamentals. He's very religious. He's really thinking only about the ultimate judge, not about the judge of history. And he's just, for all of those reasons and for John Hancock's anger against him, kind of trampled by history afterwards.
What was the biggest challenge? So you, again, just back to the earlier line of questioning, you decide that you want to immortalize and investigate Samuel Adams, and how did you go about it? There's sources on 2 continents.
Right.
How did that come to be?
So I do this thing, and I wish you could tell me if you do this too. I go to the primary documents first. And I read them through, and I don't really understand them all because I don't know the context yet.
Right.
Then I go out and I do the secondary research and the foreign archives, which in this case is London, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then I ultimately go back to the primary documents again. And this time, of course, things jump out at you that you didn't, the names are familiar, you know where this fits, you see repetitions, things begin to make a lot more sense. Mm-hmm. So it's time consuming, but it's the only way I know how to do it because you kind of want those primary materials to be setting you out into the world, to be setting the whole stage for you. In this case, there was a great wealth of stuff in the UK because all of the Crown officials whose lives Samuel Adams makes miserable are writing home regularly about this nuisance Samuel Adams, who if he could only be arrested, they would be put out of their misery. And all of those letters, which they write in quadruplicate, are saved beautifully in the British archives. So if you really want to read what he's doing, because he leaves so little on paper because he is trying to leave no paper trail, you have to read it in their accounts. So a lot of this was the material in London. There are little bits of him in a lot of places. The Rhode Island Historical Society, New Hampshire, Library of Congress, just Massachusetts Historical Society. Yeah, so there are a lot of pieces, but the bulk of the papers are in the New York Public Library.
Where you began.
Where I live, exactly,
yeah.
Which was the first time I've ever had a convenient, yes, it was really nice that way.
But now, during the pandemic, this book just out means you delivered it a year ago, means I'm just back timing all
So I had done the bulk, I was lucky, I had done the bulk of the research. And then I think librarians were so fabulous with the pandemic because one couldn't get into the archives. People were willing to Xerox things and send you material. So for example, one of the biggest caches of paper, which I did not get to, is in Michigan, the papers of General Gage, who was the commander of the British forces in these years, who's based in Boston. His papers are at the University of Michigan, and I couldn't get there. I kept trying to go, and then there would be another outbreak of COVID, and I never made it. But very kindly, the archivist there sent me the material I knew I needed, which, as you know, is not always the material that you want. But one day I will get there and find the rest of the material.
And then what will you do?
I don't know, write a second book on Samuel Adams, write the sequel. the much longed for sequel, exactly. I mean, it may be a saving grace when you can't get into an archive, right?
Sometimes you have to do you give yourself a deadline, or do you just?
I think that's the publisher's job.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not sure, I mean, would we ever agree to a deadline? I don't know what I would impose as a deadline if it weren't for the one you signed a contract with.
See, I, as a journalist, like the deadline, because that lights the fire. But
Right.
with this kind of exhaustive research, I can see how.
I think you do get to the point where you realize either you're interviewing people and you realize you're telling them more than they're telling you, which is time to stop interviewing.
Right.
Or you're realizing that you're reading, you're really not, you might be picking up a little bit of texture, or you might get a detail that you didn't otherwise have, but you're not really tangibly changing your story.
Oh, but that little texture
I know,
detail
I
is
know.
what you're all
The
about,
curse of the
right?
biographer.
Yes, you love that, and we love to read that too. But what is your rap about why history is important? It shocks me that people don't believe that we can learn. I mean, let's talk specifically about Samuel Adams in a contemporary sense, and then let's talk about all of your work, all of the biography work, history. Why is it important? People say to me that they don't care, and that really concerns me. I mean, I guess it shouldn't surprise us.
I don't know. That never dawned on me that it would seem
wouldn't.
to me. Yes, it would seem to me that we do mean to learn about how to conduct our lives, and that biography is a perfect instrument to that end. Not only in the time travel it provides, but in not wanting to sort of make the same mistakes twice. Right? I mean, I do think, to take the Salem witch trials, for example, it exists in a funny way as kind of a vaccination for us when things get. We always mention Salem when things get a little sketchy, right? I mean, things start to go off the rails. There's this moral guardrail of, aren't you doing something delusional? Aren't you doing something that you're going to regret later? Aren't you doing something that's going to be a stain on your conscience, like, those people who persecuted innocents in 1692? It just seems to me that that's one use of history, but it seems to me a very compelling use of history, right? And I think I think biography in particular, you're reading for the life you didn't live, right? You're leaving, it's a sort of out-of-body experience that we all enjoy, in the sense of, people making decisions that we may or may not be faced with, but are fundamentally familiar on some level.
How would that apply with Samuel Adams? What do you most admire of all the many achievements? Actions.
I think he's remarkable. He starts out as a sort of dullard in a funny way. He has a sort of an aimless first act, and then he is all discipline, and this is extraordinary tenacity for the next 15 years essentially, the crucial 15 years, and that unwavering devotion to a single idea. And he's the only one, as the Crown officers all make clear in their correspondence, he's the only one who's holding that doggedly to this idea. Even when things go very quiet in Boston, most people are just exhausted by all of the dissent, he's still making a fuss. And I mean, there's something about that resolute behavior that I just find tremendously appealing.
OG patriot.
Exactly.
So you are done and you can't think about next yet, right? You're still sort of letting go.
Yeah, I don't know if you have this. Do you have a sort of, it's not postpartum, you're not even quite separated yet. Not ready to start dating again, if that's what. There's just something, I partly because I've been talking about it, I suppose I've been writing about him a good deal. I'm still a little bit under his spell, a little bit too much under his spell to be able to think about a next subject. I think there comes that moment where you kind of move the material out of your office, and there's something very thrilling about that, because it's as if you've just created mental space for the next subject, and I'm just emotionally not there yet.
Maybe, I'm
Don't tell the
curious to see
publisher, by the way.
No, I'm not.
Thank you.
I'm looking over your comments to the Williams. You gave a commencement class at your alma mater, Williams, in 2013. I'm looking for something pithy and wonderful to
I wouldn't have said
quote
anything
from
pithy
you.
or
But
wonderful.
yes, no, you were great. But I don't see Ted out there. But I'm going to see if he's out there and see if we can maybe start asking questions.
Yeah, hi. It's terrific to be here and listen to you. My question is that when you were talking about the 1692 situation, it reminded me of the McCarthy period. And did you see any relationship between, in your writing on Samuel Johnson, in terms of contemporary society today, especially in the politics of today?
So many modern parallels, and when you start thinking about McCarthy and Salem, you immediately, of course, start thinking about Arthur Miller. And I think part of the reason, part of the genesis for the book for me is that I think most of us get our sense of what happened in Salem from The Crucible, which is fiction. And I think most of us forget that it's fiction. And so that too was a feeling of, I want to go back and correct the record in some way. But the McCarthy era, as the satanic ritual abuse trials, were almost perfect repeats of what had happened at Salem, absolutely. With Samuel Adams, there are a lot of modern parallels. To take two, for example, you have a moment of explosive ideas that coincides with a moment of an explosion in the media. And this is a man who's living in one of the newspaper capitals of North America and who's writing under some 30 pseudonyms and who's founding all sorts of kind of new news mechanisms, essentially, at a time when ideas are fermenting very, very quickly, simultaneously. And also you have a huge use in his world of the political, a huge attempt to draw a parallel between a political elite which is assuming more power for itself and the tyranny of Great Britain. He essentially turns a group of very wealthy, intermarried families who are essentially running New England into the face of tyranny. And he uses that in a very effective means to prove that there's a sort of stranglehold, and in his mind, a sinister stranglehold on power in New England. And I think that feels very contemporary with where we are today as well in terms of income inequality and access to opportunity.
Growing up in Adams, there's such a, I went to school in Western Massachusetts, in Amherst, and coming from Brooklyn, New York, I never had a sense of history, probably from the family that I'm from too. Do you think that your mother taught, where did your love and appreciation of history, biography come from? Because it wasn't baked into you when you were going to college, right?
Did you have those little red, white, and blue biography short lives when you were a kid? I loved those books.
I wish I had.
I'll lend you. I still have some. I can lend them to you.
I would love to borrow them.
I think that may have had something to do with it. And I think as a fledgling writer, I embraced the idea of biography because it has a structure to it. So it seemed, when attempting a first book, you think, well, there's an obvious formula, or there is a formula of some kind I can follow here. I'm not completely out in the cold. Interestingly, I lived in Andover, Massachusetts, and never knew that Andover was the town in New England that was most affected. There were more witches in Andover, Massachusetts, soi-disant witches, in 1692 than anywhere else. I had no idea of that. So much of the history passed me by, and that may have been, there may have been a remedial lesson for me in writing that book.
It's such a place so steeped in history, in American history, colonial history. I mean, it's just...
I think I did feel very comfortable when writing that book with what life in a small town felt like, because that I knew very intimately.
Right,
So.
right. Oh, there's more.
Looking forward to reading the book. I was just looking at the index, and I saw that you wrote a lot about Dr. Joseph Warren, and I was just wondering, because that's the other guy I think is, was always, just as passionate as Samuel Adams. I just wondered what you thought of the relationship between the two men.
That's such a great question. Joseph Warren was the person whom Samuel Adams clearly trusted them and felt most intimately toward. He's clearly operating as much behind the scenes as Adams is. The book opens with Paul Revere's Ride, and it opens with Paul Revere's Ride because it occurred to me one night at 3 a.m. that we all know that Paul Revere gets on a horse in mid-April of 1775 and rides furiously west, but none of us stops to think where he's actually going. And where he's going, thanks to Dr. Warren, is to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock that they're likely to be arrested, if not assassinated. And Warren is very much at the center of all of those, of both the surveillance system in Boston at that time and of all of the sort of underground rumblings, all of the sort of civil disobedience at that moment. It's very clear when he dies that Adams is crushed, and that he had considered him his closest confidant. So they work really closely together. One of the problems with both the relationship with Warren and the relationship with Paul Revere is that so little is on paper. I mean, Revere and Samuel Adams must have been in constant touch. And I think there are 2 or 3 letters between them. We have Dr. Warren's medical books, which are in the medical ledgers, which are in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And what's interesting is that he treats everybody in Boston, from the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, to Samuel Adams, and it's all in his ledgers, which are kind of amazing.
More questions? Stacy, while you go over there, I'll ask you about, as you go through these incredible archives, what do you think about today? I know everybody asks every historian this. I mean, future biographers, your biographer is going to have to go through your TikTok channel to
They're going to be really sad because I don't have one.
Right, well, that's a problem too,
But don't you have
right?
this concern? Like, for a long time, I thought there was a great server in the sky where everyone's emails were being stored, but evidently there is not.
Only if you're in legal services.
Do you print your emails?
No, I don't. Do you?
If I'm writing with someone yes is the answer to your question. If I get something that's really spectacular or particularly unusual or whatever, I do. Do I file them in any way that anyone would ever find? No, not necessarily. But yes, I don't. It's a terrible thing to think about because so much is being lost at every moment. And it, there are these eras from a documentation point of view that are better and worse. And to my mind, there's that sweet spot between the invention of the typewriter, when things get better, to the invention of email, when things get arguably worse. But outside of those realms, I mean, paper disintegrating is nothing compared to what we're going to have to contend with just an absence of documentation.
Right. How will a future biographer write?
I thought when Twitter was invented that the Library of Congress was saving every tweet.
I thought they were of the president. I don't think it was, but I
You don't think they're saving your tweets?
I don't
That's
tweet enough,
terrifying.
and I don't think I don't think anybody wants them to.
Yeah, I know that John Adams and Samuel Adams, they were second cousins and 13 years apart. But you have, and political opponents later on, but would you have the sense of how well they knew each other, or, I guess he sponsored him to be the attorney at the trial after the massacre. Anyway, how close a contact were they? Was there a General Adams family relationships in Boston? Were they too far apart that they wouldn't have known each other growing up?
That's a wonderful question, too. So they don't seem to have spent very much time together until the early 1760s. And oddly enough, I think from our vantage point, John Adams is the country cousin and Samuel Adams is the more sophisticated city cousin. And Samuel's family had been wealthy, and John grows up in a farmer's cottage in Braintree. And they seem to meet in the early 1760s in the run-up to the Sugar and Stamp Acts, when they are agreed, writes John, that they both agree that they detest Thomas Hutchinson, who is then the lieutenant governor, who will become the royal governor, and seem to fall very quickly into line with each other. They take to each other immediately. Samuel really pretty much recruits John, as he does a number of young men, including John Hancock and Josiah Quincy, and somewhat stage manages what John does as well, so that, for example, the Sons of Liberty might write to John and say, we'd really like you to do this thing for us, and then P.S., your cousin Samuel sends his warm regards, sort of like just emphasizing that we really mean for you to do this. And some of the best descriptions that we have of Samuel do come from John, who really leaves these tributes to not only how crucial his cousin was, but to what a man of exquisite humanity and decorum and affability he is. Not at all the sort of firebrand that we tend to think about. So they're working very closely together. I do not think that there's any way John Adams would have agreed to defend the soldiers after the massacre if Samuel hadn't signed off on it. It seems to have been a very smart move politically to get someone who could make sure that justice was served, but also kind of keep the secrets of Boston kind of under the radar where they needed to belong. And afterwards, there's a wonderful scene in John Adams's diary where he talks about Samuel coming to him to try to convince him to deliver a Boston Massacre oration, which was the annual kind of very emotional replaying of this horrible incident. And John begs off. He really doesn't want to do it. And it's just a wonderful kind of tug of war between these two cousins where clearly no one can resist Samuel Adams when he asks them to do something. He's very convincing and he's very determined, but John could. And you can see Samuel kind of twisting his arm, and John saying, I don't want to do politics anymore. I really can't do it. I'm too old. I'm too feeble. He's got every excuse in the world. And Samuel's just twisting, and finally he lets John off the hook. But it's just a very affectionate portrait of the two of them at work. And they work very closely together in Congress, in the First and Second Continental Congresses. They will fall out later because their visions of America are so radically different. And there's a last set of letters between them in 1790 where they're arguing between the two of them of what the proper political architecture of a republic should be. And they really come down on very different sides. John believing very much in political dynasties and institutions, and Samuel believing very much against inherited wealth and privilege, and in the power of popular sovereignty, power of the people to get what they want without any institution standing in the way. And they essentially agree to disagree.
What would he make of where we are today? I know you can't psychoanalyze him to that extent, but I'm sure you have.
I think it's hard to bring a subject into the present, especially when you don't have political when you're bringing someone from a place where there were no political parties. I think that, seeing what we have done with access to education and access to opportunity would mortify him, because that was really what he so much stood for and believed the country stood for.
You cite a book, I was so curious about this. I always read the acknowledgments first. Catherine Menand is her name?
Oh, this is such a great story, yes.
Yeah, can you tell us about that?
So when I started researching the book, Megan Marshall, who's another biographer, said to me, do you know anything about Kay Menand? And I said no. And she said, well, she was a woman who was the wife of an MIT professor and the mother of Luke Menand, the New Yorker writer, who for many years was researching a book on Samuel Adams. And Megan, who was at the time working on the Peabody sisters, would run across her at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And so I wrote to Luke Menand and said, and she's no longer alive, and I wrote to Luke and said, I'm working on a book about Samuel Adams, and he said, wouldn't you like my mother's papers? And so one of the great gifts of this book initially were 4 or 5 cartons of her work on Adams. It was a mixed bag. It's really interesting to see how another biographer worked, and she was much more interested in sort of the minutiae of the court cases when he was a tax collector. But she'd done some work that would have cost me time and spared me the time, and she did something else which was hugely helpful. As I said, there were some 30 pseudonyms, and she had identified some that I'm sure I would have missed. So I had help on the pseudonym front as well from her papers.
And she just never finished?
She wrote a draft of, I think, about 14 chapters, but never finished it, no. And it's a very different, it's not at all the kind of book I was writing, but it's factually impeccable, which some of the earlier biographers were not, and she takes them all to task in a very sort of waspish way. But it was incredibly rich in much of the sort of Boston. Many people in Boston, for example, had the same name, and she was incredibly good at being able to sort of disambiguate one Samuel Adams from the next Samuel Adams, which is the kind of work that I am not great at. And she had time in the archives that I couldn't get to because of COVID, which was a huge saving grace for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, there is a missing work that you couldn't find that may not exist anywhere, right?
Yeah, I always have to sort of a holy grail with every book, it seems. I don't know if this has happened with you.
Letters, yeah.
Yeah, like Véra's letters. And in this, Samuel Adams's grandson had written a multi-volume account of his grandfather's life, and he mentions in it a short memoir of Samuel Adams written by Samuel Adams's daughter. And I just assumed, wow, that's fabulous. I'll use that for the domestic life, and I'll have a really good sense of what his life was like with his family at home. And it is not in the Samuel Adams papers, nor has it ever turned up, which I assume means it doesn't exist anymore, but I still have that glimmer of hope that one day it will surface.
What became of his family? He had 2 children with his first wife, and
I have never met a relative. Although there should, I mean, obviously in some place there should be someone who is at least vaguely related. There are descendants of John Adams, certainly, so there's someone who's in some ancillary way related.
Well, you told me beforehand that the witches came up to you at your book signing, so
Yes.
perhaps somewhere along this trail.
I hope to meet an Adams, exactly.
That might be more realistic. Let's see.
We have time for 2 more questions.
There's one.
Thank you. You use a quote from Henry Adams in the book about politics being the systematic organization of hatreds, which struck me like a thunderbolt when I read it, given what we go through and just went through. I'd love to hear your thinking about using that quote and fitting it into Samuel Adams and today.
I'm so glad there's someone who reads the epigraphs. Thank you, because those, for me, always give the shape of the chapter. And I don't always know what the chapter is about until I get to that, make that decision. So much of what happens in the years leading up to the Boston Tea Party, anyway, is this very intimate dance between the Adams cousins and some of their Confederates and the Hutchinson and Oliver families, whom they clearly envy, despise, suspect. I mean, there's such animosity there. And I do think that animosity against that very privileged elite colors what's going to happen in terms of British legislation and the attitude toward the mother country. I think one does stand in miniature for the other. Both John Adams and Samuel Adams at different moments will compile lists of Thomas Hutchinson's titles, which take up like half a page because he's garnered so many titles, and the jobs he hasn't taken for himself he's distributed to family members. And they write this with such contempt and with such moral indignation that it really does, I mean, it almost like lights a fuse for something else. And I think that's I think that's the chapter for which I used that line. And they aren't the only ones. There are many people who seem to really begrudge Thomas Hutchinson his good fortune. And I actually feel a great deal of sympathy for poor Thomas Hutchinson, who was really only trying to do his job, although he was holding on to a lot of titles. But he's a very diligent, very dutiful public servant, and he's completely oblivious to this tide of envy and contempt that's coming his way, as he's oblivious to these new ideas that are swirling around him, for which he will become collateral damage.
And our final question for the evening.
What was the genesis of the dynamic between John Hancock and Samuel Adams?
What was the genesis of the dynamic between Samuel Adams and John Hancock? Yes. So Samuel Adams recruits John Hancock, as he does so many other younger men. And he gambles quite brilliantly that he sizes up Hancock very quickly, and he sees that Hancock, who's immensely wealthy because he's inherited one of the biggest New England fortunes, loves the spotlight and loves popular applause. And he gambles that Hancock's fortune will come in very handy to the opposition party, and that Hancock will thrive in the spotlight, thrive on all of this adoration from the people. So he does his best to kind of keep Hancock out in front, which will make him happy. Although Hancock is a very thin-skinned character, so that isn't always easy. He sometimes has to there's a lot of grooming involved here with sort of keeping John Hancock happy. They're ultimately truly the oddest couple in American history, to my mind, because Hancock is completely obsessed with things ostentatious and frivolous, and Adams is a very sober Republican who really tends toward the pious and the simple. And so it's a very uneasy relationship, and one that Thomas Hutchinson, for example, will exploit. He'll try to separate them in the 1770s, and he manages to quite effectively. John Hancock will, at a certain point, swear he never wants to see Samuel Adams again and never intends to speak to him. But the beginning of the relationship, which is what you ask about, is indeed Adams recruiting John Hancock, thinking that his money will serve the party particularly well, as it does. Adams himself seems to live on thin air. It's hinted that he had various friendly benefactors who helped to underwrite the family, and I'm sure that one of those must have been John Hancock.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
You're welcome
Thank
so
you
much.
for coming.